They sent her down like a folded apology, crumpled silk and protocol wrapped in lacquered wood, and the rain that met the ship was the color of old honey, amber beads sifting from a sky that had forgotten blue. People under the awnings laughed as if the spectacle were a creature separate from the woman who stepped out of it, a laugh of circuits, of polite cruelty. They meant for her to be spectacle. They meant for her to be a shame that glinted. Aliana kept her face as if it were a simple instrument. Her hands were not the hands of a painted monarch. They were the hands of someone who could feel the micro-vibrations in a relay plate and tell, by small, stubborn shifts, whether a system grieved or merely slept. The gown she wore caught the rain and sent it down in tiny, luminous beads that slid off embroidered wire like mercury off glass. A courier untied the offending ribbon with mechanical politeness. The crowd took pictures with their eyes and kept them. The colony's port smelled of warmed metal and the slow, sweet sour of repair oil. The ship's engines exhaled, and the crowd dispersed into work and gossip. Amber rain soaked into the soil and hissed against the hull of the docking gantries, and the story they had been sent here to display, a fairy queen brought like a gift meant to mock, became, beneath the water of ordinary days, something else, a human body finding a rhythm. She found the rhythm in a workshop that had once been a municipal waterworks and then a theater of failing pumps. Inside, the hum of arrays and the cut-glass rattle of relay bays could drown out courtly memory if you let them. Tools lay like well-read books, spanners that had fit hands for decades, soldering irons with nicked grips, tins of flux with mottled labels that remembered other colonies. Corin moved among them with the kind of certainty that belongs to technicians and to men who do not distract from the machine's music. He wore a plain ring, unadorned metal, a circle that had been buffed until it held the reflection of everything around it, and when he laughed, it sounded like a door being closed well. Their beginning was not cinematic. It was coffee shared over a bench while a diagnostic hummed low and steady. It was a moment where Aliana, who had once given speeches that rearranged rooms, had to learn the simple choreography of handing a tungsten rod correctly to steady solder. She learned how to listen to the minute rhythm of a corroded contact, how slight heat coaxed a stubborn seam to agree to hold. Corin taught her to read the names traces left on motherboards like fingerprints. She taught him, without intending to, how to see, when he tightened a bolt, the story that hands tell, the small give in knuckles, the way a wrist remembers repetition. In the colony, miracles were called repairs. The prayer of that community was skill, and the altar was a bench with a vice. Aliana took to it with a kind of fierce humility.
She could have wept for the way a relay sang back when coaxed right. Instead, she wiped flux with the hem of a sleeve and smiled at the machine, as if apologizing for its pain. The machine did not answer in words. It answered in light. They built a life in small seams. Morning light found them under an array of rusted gutters as Corin showed her how to tune a buffer temperature, how to watch a phase drift for the very first signs of trouble. Their hands met often under the hood of things. They kept each other's secrets as much as they kept each other's coffee cups. When her laugh came out small in the bending air of the workshop, the workers who had been given other people's titles watched and in time stopped measuring her by the dress she arrived in and started measuring her by the stubborn loyalty with which she resurrected broken parts. Rumors sailed back through the colony as if they had sails. The capital would notice. It had noticed because the ceremonial technicians, who arrived in their immaculate vests and with protocol sheets folded like origami, had not expected to see the machine come to life. They had brought a calibration device, bright and cold and wired with bureaucratic taste, to test the colony and, perhaps as a performance, to find a way to make them fail. The device's diagnostics had been tuned to create spectacle, a failure to be televised back to the court, humiliation, and a lesson. Instead, Aliana and Corin spent a night with stubborn lamps and dirty fingers, bending incoming diagnostics into a song the machine would accept. Their method was not dramatic. It was methodical. They listened. They rerouted a feedback loop with a spare relay plate, taped in a shim of old composite, sang a small, private litany of tests until the calibration bell, the one that was supposed to toll for someone else's undoing, rang with true note instead of mocked dissonance. The panel flashed a green the color of new leaves, and the observers, who traded in protocol and spectacle, had nothing to flash across their screens but the news that they had been wrong. Recognition arrived as a sealed envelope and as an envoy in a ceremonial court. It came with the measured politeness of those who had assumed control. Governor Merrick, pragmatic and fond of simple economies, received them with a smile that was not quite surprised. The colony celebrated in the way colonies do, with food shared across long planks and with hands lifted in repair, each attendee remembering the nights when the pump had not worked and the nights when it had. Yet recognition always carries taste of metal. It arrives as offer as much as flattery. The prize the Capitol offered was written in precise silver script. Resources, a clearer berth in the imperial catalogs, the possibility of better arrays and better medicine. The price was not named with bluntness.
It came as suggestions: reintroduction to court, ceremonial appearances to certify the colony, a public return that would be, in the court's language, restorative. Governor Merrick read the lines aloud with a tact that made him sound both hopeful and tired. The colony listened with a kind of collective tightness in their chests. To accept would be to take what they needed and risk. What? Their small life? Their autonomy? The identity they had carefully woven from rain and solder? There were other signs. The ambassador's eyes lingered on Corin in a manner that was polite and also quietly exact. He noticed the ring. Rings in that place were small things that carried policy like armor. Corin's ring was plain. One could have said he bought it with no eye for ceremony. But the courts keep memory in metal. The ambassador's hand, while moving, showed a flicker of recognition, like a relay that remembered a frequency it had heard long ago. Aliana watched all of this and learned the way statecraft smells when it is polite, faintly of perfumed ink and of the cold antiseptic of dispatches. She measured offers against the smell of solder. When the governor suggested a measured path back to capital favor, "You could return," he said, serving as a symbol. "The Empire will provide the things you require to help your people." She nodded as if she understood the grammar, and then in a quieter way, she counted bolts and reserves in her head. It was Corin who loosened the first unsaid question by taking a ring from his finger in the cool of the workshop and setting it on the bench between them like an admission. They had been sitting on a bench with a strip light humming over them, a half-repaired pump between their knees. He had fixed a relay, wiped his hands on a rag, and then the ring, which had a small, barely perceptible etching inside, was in both of their sightlines, and he was not looking away. "You have been holding back," Aliana said, because she had learned to sense the ways people keep silence in their shoulders. The question was not merely curiosity, it was the practical requirement of choosing. If a man has held back because he is afraid of what the Capitol will recognize, that changes how you answer their offers. It changes strategy. Corin's laugh was small and empty for a moment. He touched the ring and saw for the briefest sliver of a second, not the bench but the long corridor of a palace lined with slow-moving attendants. He could have lied with ease. He had a talent for small omissions. Instead, he sat back and let the confession be an instrument. He spoke not like a man claiming glory, but like someone returning a badge to the floor. "They call it a circle of office," he said. "Names are clumsy. They called me things I never answered to. People who write ledger entries use words for me, titles like land, like command. They flatter themselves that a word can hold a man."
"I was called what the Empire reads aloud when it wants to make saints." He paused, seeing her watch him, not with courtly hunger, but with a kind of precise attention that had more to do with machine learning than with obedience. "They called me Emperor," he said. The word landed like a small coin on the bench. It could have been bravado, it could have been vanity, but his fingers were dirty and his voice was quiet. There was no hysteric reclaiming of power. There was only the way that men give away what they no longer want to be responsible for. Corin looked at the ring, and then at Aliana, and in the light of the strip, his face was not made for performance. He was, in that moment, a man who had lived inside the hollow of ceremony and had walked out. "I left," he said, "not because I thought it was noble, but because the weight of being watched every hour, that script, turned me into someone I did not recognize in the mirror. I walked out before I could be written clean by their rituals. I learned to like the taste of coffee unmeasured. I learned to fix a pump because the pump needs fixing, and no one else will call it a miracle for you. I wanted ordinary." Aliana listened to him with the quiet thoroughness she gave to machines. His confession did not make the Empire any less imperial. It made it more dangerous, perhaps, because an emperor who had once been a man, and now wished to remain a man, could be to the court a theft. It made them a story with edges, and stories with edges are valuable to empires. Later that week, while the colony mended and while the capital's envoys sent careful congratulations, Aliana went to the medbay for an unrelated check. The medtech was a woman who had hands calloused by years of stitches and by holding the insistent pylons of circuit boards in her palms.
She was kind in the way people are kind when their work has taught them where small things matter. "It will just be a quick read," the medtech said, and Eliana felt the familiar prickle of being examined in a way that read both body and record. The scanner smelled faintly of ozone. The readout blinked in green and white. When the technician's face changed, though, subtly, she did not ask for drama. She simply tilted the monitor toward Eliana. The screen showed what at first looked like two shadows cradled in a longer shadow of life. The medtech's instruments translated in a soft voice. "There are 2 cardiac rhythms." She let the silence hold them both. Eliana's breath changed like a machine warming up. There was a part of her that cataloged outcomes like repair budgets. It assessed resources, childcare, the question of how a colony would protect 2 new lives when imperial attention sharpened like a scythe. Another part, older and softer, was instantly luminous with a kind of wonder she had not expected to be allowed to feel after exile. Twins. 2 small lives placed without consultation into the middle of everything.
She went back to the workshop where Koren was tightening a strut on a relay housing and laid her hand on his forearm. For a moment he did not look up because the world of his hands required his eyes. Then he did, and the look he gave her was something like a schematic being redrawn in quick strokes. Recalibrate, prepare for load, hold. "There are 2, she said. The words were small and immediate. He closed his fingers around hers like a clamp. The ring on the bench, the ring he had set down, caught light. 2, he repeated. His mouth was dry. The word was a kind of prayer he had not known how to pray. 2, he said again, and then he did something very quiet. He put his hand over the ring and the bench and aligned them together, as if to say he would not let one slip away without holding the other. The discovery multiplied everything. The Empire's attention was no longer merely about a skilled exile with a touch of glamour. It was a matter of lineage, of succession by rumor and by law, even if those laws had been written to justify claims and not to protect lives. A child born into a household with a ring, and a ring whose metal had been recognized by an envoy, could become the hinge upon which the court tried to swing a colony back under ceremonial control. They tried for a while to keep it private. There is a kind of stubborn courage in secrecy. There is also the mundane logistics that make secrecy almost a kind of honesty. Eliana went about the days with the slow deliberation of one who is reorganizing a blueprint. They began to plan for 2 not as a spectacle, but as the urgent, beautiful thing they were. Small lives who would need meals, the soft noises of machines at night, someone to read by lamplight when the rains came down in honeyed threads. They reinforced cradles, they checked medicinal reserves, they altered shift patterns. Yet news does not live in sealed rooms for long, especially when the court has applied a lens to you. The envoy who had watched the trial asked for an audience under the pretense of congratulations. His smile was ceremonial, and its edges were reinforced with language meant to soothe. He spoke of heritage, and of the Empire's willingness to help those who bear its names and legacies. He spoke delicately of support. There are things you notice when you have been trained to read metal. The envoy's napkin was creased in a way that repeated the alphabet of courtly etiquette. The way his sleeve caught on the edge of the table revealed an emblem worked so finely that only someone who had memorized imperial symbology could recognize it. He did not use the emperor's name. He did not need to. He used possibilities and offers. He used safety. Eliana listened to him with the ear of a technician who knows how to read fault lines. "We would like to offer resources," the envoy said. "We can provide enhanced arrays, certified med teams, and an opportunity for formal restoration to court."
Think of what that would mean for your people's infrastructure. Restoration, Eliana repeated. The word tasted both possible and poisoned. The colony's pumps hummed their own answer like an undercurrent. Koren's hand on her bench seemed to be trying to calculate leverage. Governor Merrick's counsel was, as ever, pragmatic. He read the envoy's words as if they were proposals on a ledger. "If the Empire pays for a raise," he said, "we secure better health and better water for the settlement." He folded his hands like a man who had watched many bargains and knew that they were often shadows in daylight. The envoy's smile softened. "Of course," he said, "we would simply request that the figurehead of such a restoration, the public face, the ceremonial presence, be the person known to hold those titles, to bring history toward reconciliation.
It was a polite phrase for a proper claim. Aliana's palms were cool, but inside the hush of her chest, a small alarm sang like a misaligned coil. Corin's jaw tightened so that the vein in his temple throbbed. The ring at his finger caught the light as if to say its own name. That night, in the narrow dark of the workshop, where the light was no more than the small arc of a lamp, they arranged the things that need arranging. They spoke in the language of practicalities because it was easier to move boats than to move hearts. They counted crates, checked the medical supplies again, ran diagnostics on storage heaters. They wrote small lists in pencil and then rubbed them out because the pencil had a life of its own and would not be still. "I left because I wanted to be a man again," Corin said, touching the ring as if it were an ember. "I left so I wouldn't have to be what others called me. I did not think the world would keep knocking like a debt collector." Aliana heard the apology in his voice and the fear beneath it. It was not the fear of losing power. It was the fear of having something taken, of the colony being called to be a stage where their children would be displayed as relics of reconciliation. "We can refuse," she said. The phrase felt both true and impossible. "We can say no and keep the colony. We can keep our smallness." "And if we say no," Corin asked, "what becomes of two newborns when the Empire can write your name and their faces into law? If anything, blood makes things easier to claim." They were both speaking as technicians who know how to test for failure. They mapped the failure modes out: coercion through resources, legal claims on custody, media narratives that would recast them not as a family, but as a prize to be returned to the proper shelves of history. Each failure mode carried costs the colony might not vault. In the end, for a while there was no end. They slept in shifts like workers who hold continuity of service over celebration. They patched what needed patching. The ring lay in a small leather puck on the bench, not as a trophy but as a memory. On the morning that changed the shape of the conversation, the morning when the sky opened like a slow, sweet faucet and amber rain threaded down in stiff ribbons, a courier arrived with a dispatch that bore a seal rarely sent across colonies. It was small and cold and heavy. It had a texture the way old pages do when they remember their lords. Governor Merrick took it and did not break the seal at once. The envoy from the capital had not yet come to the colony in person, and yet the letter's presence was a kind of pressure, a formal chord that vibrated through the administrative bones. He read it at his desk, where the light trimmed his profile. His hands were steady, even when the paper asked them to be not. When he folded it back, his face was the color of someone somberly weighing a ledger. He looked at Aliana and Corin as if they were items on that page, and then he spoke. "It is not a request," he said. He did not raise his voice. "They ask that the colony consider emissaries to oversee the transition, if you accept restoration. It is a courtesy, but one wants to recognize that an offer so framed carries implications." Corin's hand clenched, and the knot in his throat tightened. He stood and went to the bench and opened his palm to the ring, for the ring seemed, in the presence of imperial ink, to be a map that could be read by other hands. "They will stone you with protocol," he said to Aliana, and the words were not a threat so much as the clear-sightedness of someone who had watched court rituals carve men into shapes to be displayed. Aliana looked at the envoy's seal, and then at the bench where they had repaired the pump that kept the colony's cistern flowing. She thought of small hands, sucking the future like light. She thought of the way a blossom tilts open in a place that knows how to be small and blooms anyway. "Then we decide," she said. The sentence was not grand. It was a plan. They made preparations to host the emissaries. They put the workshop in a state that would not embarrass them. They did not alter their lives into performances. They cooked simple food for visitors. They planted a pot of herbs at the workshop door and gave visiting dignitaries a cup that tasted like the earth here. When the emissaries did arrive, they came wrapped in calm. They wore uniforms that were precise and correct. They carried small boxes of instruments and a ledger that smelled of varnish. The lead emissary, a woman whose face seemed designed by expedience, greeted them with the exact smile the envoy from the capital had used in his letters. She studied the ring on the bench as if she had seen similar ones in books. Her gloved fingers hovered for a second over it, not touching. She spoke with a warmth that was trimmed with a protocol edge. "The Empire recognizes talent," she said. "It also recognizes lineage and the need to protect that which may become a symbol of unity.
We would be willing to oversee a reintegration that secures both your people's needs
and the dignity of your household. Her words contained both benediction and clause. They were terms dipped in sugar and shadow. Corin did not look at the emissary. He did not have to. The ring at his palm had been recognized in more than one way. It carried a memory others could read if they knew where to look. It was not the kind of ring that promised power so much as the kind that invited claims. The emissary's speech tightened the conversation into a matter of custody and of spectacle. That evening, when the rain had softened into steady mist, Aliana sat with Corin on the bench. The colony hummed its private music all around them. The pump, the children running along canalways, the distant note of a bell that measured the shift changes. She rested her palm on the ring again, the metal cool against her skin. She thought of the 2 small calyxes shown on the med display and of the long ledger sent by the Empire. "They will want the story," Corin said, not unkindly. "They will provide a tidy narrative. A fallen queen is restored, an emperor's old house is reunited, prosperity follows. They will want the twins to symbolize that. The children will be valuable to them." Aliana's fingers tightened. "What do we want the story to be?" she asked. He looked at her then in a way that made the workshop feel like a cathedral. "That we chose the life," he said. "That we chose hands and coffee before ceremony. That we chose to be small on purpose." She thought of the ring again and of the way empire writes itself into names. The notion of choosing was not naive. The empire would not simply take if they said no. It would maneuver, propose, buy the colony's needs so that debts gathered like cobwebs, and then tighten them. Choosing would mean making the choice with knowledge of the risks. Aliana thought for a long minute of the kinds of miracles the colony practiced. The way a pump would be coaxed back from death. The way a child who had swallowed a shard of wire could be patched and ready to laugh again. She thought about the world she had been offered in court, a place where every movement had audience, and where the smallest domesticity could be rewritten into myth. She had not been allowed to be ordinary there. Here, she had earned ordinariness with her hands. "We must talk to the others," she said finally. "This is not just about us." They did. In the kitchen where the workmen sat after a shift, and in the infirmary where the medtech kept a neat file of prenatal powders, they spoke to those who knew the colony's capacities and vulnerabilities. The chorus that gathered was not made of one voice. Some feared the Empire's retribution if they refused. Some saw the benefit: strengthened arrays, better medicine, more food. Others feared that it all might come with strings that would strangle.
Most of them, at the end of the night, cared for the small and immediate things. Will the pumps be maintained? Who will cook? Who will tend the children if we are pulled into ceremonial obligations that last for weeks at a time? The decision did not resolve itself into a tidy answer. The colony, like every community, contained within it the seeds of dissent and the seeds of solidarity. They argued with the warmth of people who know how to make meals from little. They posted small lists of pros and cons on the tavern wall. They read imperial dispatches with a hungry, suspicious eye. And yet the Empire did not wait idly. It sent more emissaries with measured offers, and with them came a softer pressure, a historian who wanted to record the Queen's exile, and an engineer who wanted to map the colony's power grid for efficiency. Their visits were full of the precise, helpful language of improvement. Their help would have been transformative for water reserves and for newborns and for the brittle teeth of old pumps. It would be hard to refuse such utility when the cost was a word and a public appearance. Then came a smaller, more intimate pressure, an invitation to a formal event in which the Empire would, in ceremony, acknowledge those who had chosen reconciliation. It was a pageant the envoy described as restorative. The invitation was generous in its tone and specific in its symbolism. It was the kind of thing that recast a colony as a benefactor stage. Aliana and Corin did not answer immediately. They walked together through the rain to the edge of the sea, where the waves, under the amber light, looked like panels of polished brass. Corin held her hand, and their fingers fitted like parts of a socket. There was a brief, private conversation that was less words than agreements. "If they will use the children to make us small," he said, "I will break any chain they try to lay on them." "You cannot break a law with wrenches," she replied,
but you can reroute how it works." He smiled, and in that smile there was a plan forming, as mechanical as any they had ever made. They were technicians. The tools of resistance were not theatrical rebellions, but the careful articulation of infrastructure, the ability to reroute supplies, to make surveillance blind by throwing the right dust into the right channels, to mislabel manifests. It was not romance. It was craft as defiance. They began to prepare not for a battle, but for a series of small, practical maneuvers that would protect two infants before the court could make them symbols. They taught a few trusted hands how to decoy manifest reads and how to make a medscan output look as if twins were not present when fed to the wrong reader, then the right one. They scheduled the medtech to be at the ready with a plausible excuse for any need to delay an envoy's visit.
They planned to take what the colony needed and leave what they refused, but such a plan required timing and a knowledge of the court's calendars. As they worked the plan, they received a quiet confirmation, a note left at the workshop door in the middle of the amber night. It was small and folded and anonymous. Inside, a single phrase in careful hand. "We know what you have." The phrase was both a threat and a promise. It was written on paper that had the watermark of Imperial courier networks. The presence of such a note was a proof that they were being watched by something that read not only metal etchings, but rumor and the smallest human gestures. Corinne's hand closed on the bench. This was not the life he had wanted. He had left a palatial corridor in order to hold coffee and to hear a pump sing. Now, what had been private now had the weight of a public ledger. Aliana, with the tender, technical way of someone who knows where to apply heat so a seam will hold, spoke in a smaller voice. "We will not hand them over to be a symbol," she said. "We will make them ours and make sure the Empire has to choose how it wants to take what we refuse to give." They began to prepare in earnest, with the small things that make plans possible: a set of false manifests tucked into the lining of an acoustic panel, a relay array tuned to throw off a distant watcher's read, a medkit hidden in a hollowed beam of the storage loft. Not sabotage, not violence, practical deceit for practical safety. It felt like prayer. The colony rallied in small, private ways. A woman who mended nets offered to mend an all but invisible cradle with the same patient stitches she used on nets. A pair of teenagers who knew the route of every gutter laid down a cover so that a courier's foot would not leave a clean print at night. They were not conspirators in a dramatic sense. They were neighbors who valued that a life could be ordinary and that ordinary lives were worth defended engineering. And then, sometime between the ringing of the evening bell and the city's last hum, a ship cut the amber sky with a line of thrummed cold. It was not announced by pomp. It was announced by tone, a low chord that the colony had begun to learn as Imperial. People stopped in doorways. Tools hung quietly in half-worn hands. The ship did not land. It cast shadow and left a single small thing to be found on the docks, a sealed dispatch stamped with the Empire's emblem, and beneath it an additional seal, the ambassador's personal mark. Governor Merrick held it then. He did not open it before them. He read the seal, bowed to the ritual of courtesies, and then looked up with eyes that had the color of a man about to tally a dangerous sum. "They will send a team," he said. "They will send official safeguards and a program to ensure the twins' welfare. It is not phrased as coercion. It will be phrased as care." Aliana felt the rain on her face and the weight of the ring on the bench. She wanted suddenly a simple answer: to keep two small lives safe in a colony that had chosen to be small. She also felt the long, ancient law of star courts, where lineage becomes ledger. They had made themselves small on purpose. The world might decide otherwise. Corin folded the ring into his palm, like he was holding a tiny, living thing. "Then we will need to be cleverer," he said. There was a defiance in his voice that was not loud, but very steady. It did not promise triumph. It promised resistance. He had been emperor in a glass room that liked to make relics out of people. Now he chose the workbench, and the pump, and the child's small shape. The choice would not stop the capital from wanting to claim them, but it would create a boundary they would guard with cunning and with the resources of the only things they trusted: skill and community. Aliana watched the envoy seal. She thought of the two frames on the med screen, two small silhouettes cupped in an arc of life. The future of those two lives stretched before her as a problem and as a tenderness. She had been sent as an apology and a spectacle. She would answer with solder and with a resolve that would make no unnecessary grandeur. When the night closed,
The colonists did not sleep easily. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who know what work means. The bench where the ring lay stood like a small altar. The ring itself, once an emblem and now a disputed memory, reflected the lamp and the muted rain outside like an eye. It held all the quiet things the workshop could not say out loud: fear, defiance, the ordinary stubborn love that will not yield without calculation. The emissaries would come in days. The empire would test with kindness and with law. The colony would practice the art of small defiance, reroutes, decoys, misreads that would protect infants and pump and program. They would not attempt to match the court in grandeur. They would attempt to meet it in the one arena it underestimated, a village's ability to be relentlessly ordinary. At the edge of the workshop, as rain threaded down the corrugated iron, Aliana slipped the ring into the pocket of her work coat, not to hide it as treasure, but to carry its memory next to her talk with machines, next to the small, deliberate acts of care she would do for the 2 lives that were now hers to keep. She and Corin would not surrender the children to be rewritten into someone else's story. They would not be spectacle. They would be a family that fixes pumps and shares coffee. And far above them, in the clean corridors of the capital, the court murmured and wrote and planned its gentle offers. They believed in their own grammar, that a person's return to their stations would be reset of history. They did not yet understand that sometimes leaving the station, sometimes choosing ordinariness, rewrites the ledger in the quiet language of care.
If you want to follow Aliana and Corin's story, to see whether hands and community will outmaneuver ceremony and seal, hit subscribe and stay for the next episode of their lives. The letter from the ambassador lay unopened for a while longer on the governor's desk. The seal needed to be broken in a certain way. The proper person had to break it. Inside would be offers, and inside those offers would be clauses that asked for something. The colony's hearths hummed. 2 small shadows lay like the promise of spring in an otherwise brittle world. The choice the colony had to make would not only be about safety or status, it would be about the language with which they wanted to teach new life to speak. At dawn, a courier from the capital arrived once more, this time with a small bundle of items, an official recognition badge, some medical supplies stamped with imperial insignia, and, folded in tissue, an old page from a ledger with a single line circled in ink. It was a name. Corin caught the fold with a hand that did not tremble, though his breath staccato told its own story. He unfolded the paper slowly. The circled line was not long. It carried the weight of many rooms where important things are decided in small lines. "They have the record," he said. His voice was almost a whisper, as if the paper itself could hear them. "They have the record that once someone was called what an empire calls its center. They can use it. They can write law about it." Aliana pressed her hand to the bench, to the place where solder cools and where things find shape. She thought of 2 times 2. She thought of the children's small pulses like 2 separate calibrations. They would be measured by other people's pens if they let the empire's offer be their story. "Then we write with our hands," she said. "We write with our cups, with our pumps, with the way we wake to fix a heater in the dead of night. We write with what keeps us breathing. We do not let them make our children into pageantry." Corin nodded, his ring pressed into his palm like a pledge. They began then not a war, but a long, patient campaign of small things. Inventory mislabels that would not deprive any child, but would confuse a manifest. A scheduled visit that turned into an inspection of a pump needing extensive repair. The relocation of certain crates into locked chests that required obscure keys. Every act was crafted with the precision of a technician, with the tenderness of people who loved the idea of ordinary mornings. And outside, the amber rain kept falling, like an attentive audience. They received the emissaries on a morning that tasted of solder and citrus peel. Small comforts, the cache of preserved oranges Governor Merrick kept for guests, the library's thin soaps for freshening hands between handshakes. The lead envoy's uniform was immaculate in a way that made routine into ritual. His gloves were the color of bone, his smile a practiced indentation.
He spoke in the soft, exact language of improvement, enumerating arrays and med teams as if listing available fixtures. He praised the colony's ingenuity and spoke gently of the needs of posterity. Aliana watched him from the edge of the crowd, fingers folded in the way machines fold when they cool. She had planned for the meeting not with theatrical outrage, but with efficiency. Behind the emissary's silk veneer, the colony had placed its small defenses, diversions, alternates, and a chain of minutiae which, when linked, formed a practical, if fragile, shield. The plan was not to deceive for malice, but to reroute destiny into the hands that had earned the right to hold it. 2 clinics were set, a visible one with clean linens and the emissary's preferred equipment, and a hidden one, an old pump room retooled into a birthing suite, where the medtech, Mara, would take the measures necessary to keep their children safe from registry and spectacle. Mara's fingers had the surety of someone who had learned to stitch arteries and wire arrays without ceremony. She moved through the workshop like a spirit whose prayers were practical. Corin, who had not wanted any stage for himself, stood at the edge of the official gathering, a hand on the bench where the ring had lived for so many tense nights. He wore a simple coat. It had the same plainness as the ring, and both were deliberate. He looked like a man who had reconciled himself to a certain kind of public work, not the adulation of audiences, but the necessary humility of making visible what needed doing. There was no flamboyance in him, only a clear, unadorned line of choice. The colony's technicians had carved their roles into the strategy with the same skill they used to coax a failing pump back to life. Some were in the crowd, acting as if they had come to watch. Others were in the comms room, a low vaulted space lined with repurposed broadcast panels. One of them, Joss, who had learned to solder with a trembling hand and now moved with serene, precise gestures, sat before a bank of outdated streaming devices. He had wrapped a rusted relay in fresh flux and a ribbon of polymer to hide its new purpose. It would take a moment in the broadcast spectrum. It would take, in practice, a thin window when the Imperial feed would be routed through their input. At Mara's direction, a decoy medstream sat ready, an image manipulated so that Imperial eyes would read the clinic's data and see what they were supposed to see. The trick was not to lie so much as to reroute. The med scanner's readout would be fed through Joss's relay and then into the Empire's registry stream. The registry would log what it could parse. The feed would be timed to the ceremony's opening chords, a musical cue the emissary liked for theatrical effect, so that the court's attention momentarily would be occupied by spectacle and not minute verifications. Aliana did not like deception for deception's sake.
She liked the idea of making the court's systems compliant with her people's needs. If the Empire insisted on writing history in its ledger, she would make sure the ledger recorded the truth they had chosen to live, that the children would be under colony guardianship, and that any ceremonial link to a returned emperor would be contested by undeniable acts of parentage and custody that proved everyday care. The emissary made his little speeches, and the colony answered with ritual politeness. Governor Merrick read their proposed terms aloud like a man setting a puzzle on the table. The crowd applauded politely. At the bench, Corin kept his face like a calm instrument. He had, as part of their preparation, chosen words that sounded like surrender and felt like a lock, phrases that signaled acceptance without offering the specifics the court sought. He signed a preliminary paper in a way that looked like compliance and handed the emissary a small wooden box with the colony's seal, one that contained nothing but a few thoughtful seeds and a handwritten note about water flow. Across the yard, under the pretext of showing the emissaries how their pumps were maintained, Mara slipped from the visible clinic to the hidden one. The medtech's kit smelled of disinfectant and warm metal. She checked the scanners, greens and white arrays, and set the trick devices in place, a small array to output a plausible waveform of 2 cardiac rhythms when poured over quickly, a buffer to smooth artifacts so distant readers would see an image comfortably legible and unremarkable. The real data, the true registry, would be diverted into a sealed ledger accessible only by the colony's med files, a legal nest they would keep and guard. When the ceremony began in earnest, a small stage set up with imperial flags and a cord that the ambassador loved, the colony's plan moved like clockwork. Joss flicked switches in time with the music. He fed the medstream into the imperial line through the relay encoded under a protective sleeve. The registry took the feed and amended the record, the way computers do when presented with apparently authoritative input. The imperial camera fell for the decoy. The ledger, in the way bureaucracies are made by data, recorded the narrative the colony wanted for the moment. The visual archive of equipment, the ceremonial note of mother and father presenting themselves as appropriate, and the med read showing a family picture that would later be layered with official ribbons. The feed made the Empire's cameras find what they were prepared to see, and because what they were prepared to see fitted their grammar, they did not look deeper. But there was more to be done than shifting images. Legal instruments are stubborn and can be amended later when attention returns.
The colony's second, quieter task was to create a document trail that made the Empire's claim both messy and expensive to enforce. Affidavits showing continuous custody by the colony's midwife, notarized witnesses who had lived with the parents for weeks, scheduled vaccine records, and a ledger of supplies that proved a continuous, unbroken parental care routine. Paper can be altered, yes, but when it is interlaced with so many local records and human testimony, enforcement becomes a political cost. The empire could still try, but it would be costly in attention and in the goodwill of those who read not just ledgers, but small lives. At noon, Aliana felt the first steady change, an inner tightening that was not a surprise, but a new kind of certainty. She excused herself from the crowd and moved with Corin to the hidden clinic where Mara sat with a calm fire in her eyes. The paling light through the pump room's grated window fell on a stack of towels and on a small metal relay that now hummed an unobtrusive, purposeful note. They had done everything they knew to do in the weeks leading up to this moment. They had learned to reroute manifest reads and to mislabel crates in ways that did not cause harm. They had taught a few trusted technicians to lie with the precision of surgeons, only when lies served to protect, never to take. They had rehearsed 1,000 small tasks. Who would distract a courier? Who would answer a question in a tone that sounded sincere but withheld a truth? Who would carry a false ledger to a dusty shelf as performance? Still, in the heart, there is a place that holds a child's first breath, and no plan alters the magnificence or the fear of it. Aliana moved to a chair where she could see the bench and the ring there like a rumor. Corin sat at her side, unclasping the plain band and laying it between them, an old map of what had been and what might be. His fingers trembled in a manner that had never been for show. It was for fear, yes, and for the weight of being seen by history. "Will they be safe?" Aliana asked, not because she needed reassurance, so much as because naming the fear made it an object they could test for failure. "Not absolute," Corin answered. "Safety is not a law we can buy. It's a circuit we have to keep closed." He reached for her hand, and his fingers found hers like sockets fitting together. "We'll close it." The labor was long in a way that made time take a new shape. Each contraction a metered beat, each breath an oscillation the body learned to tune to. Mara guided Aliana through methods that were sharp and gentle. Corin's hands were everywhere and nowhere, resting on Aliana's shoulder one moment, tightening a strap on a relay the next. He paced the architecture of care as he had paced engine rooms, with work and attention, and with a stubborn faith that machines, bodies, hold themselves together when tended. Outside, the official program continued, polite speeches sliding into polite music.
The emissaries were delighted by the visible niceties. They took tours of visible pumps and arrays the colony had polished for them. They tasted the governor's chosen dishes and nodded in the right places. The cameras of the Capitol caught what was meant to be caught. A polite feed showed a restoration that, in photograph, looked complete. Inside the hidden clinic, the world narrowed to skin and breath and the scent of warmed saline. Aliana's face was all concentration and quiet fury, the kind born when one defends a future not yet written. Corin spoke little. His job was logistics and solace. He whispered practical things. Breathe their way. Press the calf. Hold here. Instructions that were both helpful and prayer-like in their repetition. When at last the first child arrived, a small, sharp cry that sounded like a calibration bell ringing true, Mara set the infant against Aliana's chest. The noise that rose in that cramped room was not triumph, but a sort of stunned tenderness. Corin wept, a small, surprised sound he did not apologize for. He pressed his forehead to Aliana's and to the infant, and the ring in his palm felt like a slow heartbeat. There was no fanfare. There was only the hum of the relay feeding the imperial stream and the scrubbed, weary truth of 2 small lungs working. The first child smelled of warm milk and of salt. The skin was like a new coin. They named this one. Names in the colony were small and based on work or weather, a practice meant to root people in place. They chose a name that meant anchor. The second delivery came within the same cycle of breath, and when that cry issued, it multiplied the feeling in the room like the second note in a chord. 2 children, 2 calibrations, 2 small hands curling like tiny clamps. Mara placed the second child into Aliana's arms, and the 2 infants blinked up at the light that filtered through the pump room's grated window, twin shadows articulated into sound. Outside, the imperial feed recorded their staged return as the colony produced the figures it wanted presentable, a mother, a father, a dignified bench. The lead envoy smiled. The ambassador noted the ring, but noted it like a man who clips the memory into his mental file. The cameras did their tidy work, but the real legal registration was not the shiny one on the feed. Joss's relay had already delivered an amended record to the registry, a document that, when later cross-checked, created a lattice of custody claims favoring the colony, midwife affidavits, medical charts, homestead petitions. The feed would remain a photograph without legal teeth unless the Empire chose to expend significant judicial attention. The colony had made the cost of such attention its defense. In the hours after the births, the workshop became a makeshift nursery. The colony's women and men moved with the practiced care of those who had learned to fold life out of scarcity.
A midwife who had once mended nets now crafted tiny blankets that smelled like flax and old oil. Teenagers accustomed to tracing gutters now wove a mobile of reclaimed brass and beads that chimed to the sound of a relay. They performed acts that were, in themselves, modest rebellions, to insist daily that small life continues, that routine will give shape to history. Corin kept a vigil heavy with both tenderness and resolve. He placed the ring into a wooden box and sealed it with the colony's wax. Not a sign of abdication, but a mark. He was not going to let his past be used as a key without contest. He wrote a small note to tuck beneath the ring, a note that read like a technical instruction. This object is a memory. Treat it accordingly. He then placed the box inside a secured chest, whose manifest had been misfiled for exactly this purpose, so that, should the court seek the ring, they would find it as a piece of local history rather than as an instrument for claim. The emissaries left the colony the next day with a kind of satisfied smile that belongs to officials confident in their grammar. They had footage, they had token alliances, they had words of commendation. In the capital, their dispatches would read like a small victory: an exile restored, heritage recognized, assistance planned. They would be pleased to have overseen a reconciliation that suited the image they liked. But the colony's files that had been written into the registry told a more complicated tale. Custody recorded by local presence, medical attestations attesting to continuous care, legal petitions lodged across numerous low-level offices that would need time and political capital to reverse. The Empire noticed, but slowly and in ways that require time. A letter did arrive weeks later, not in the morning but in a bracketed noon dispatch, a curt message that requested audits and clarifications, which in practice reads as a polite opening to litigation. There were thin threats in the phrasing. For the sake of propriety, we request. The court was not yet angry so much as surprised, and surprise will often give way to procedure. For now, the colony had bought itself a margin of ordinary days, and ordinary days breed experience, which builds defenses that paper cannot easily unweave. Those days were full, not of pomp, but of feeding and laundry, and checking heater buffers in the long amber nights. The infants slept like small machines that needed gentle oiling. Their cries were mapped in the memory of the workshop: who would wake first, which citizen could patch a fever in the middle of the night, which neighbor could make a broth that soothed an infant's hunger. The colony's small rituals, tea brewed at a certain hour, a whistle that calls apprentices to the bench, folded the twins into life with ordinary urgency and extraordinary tenderness. Corin watched them, and sometimes, when he lay awake, he saw the palace corridor again. It had not been an illusion. It had been a life he had left with his boots still warm. He had been called by others with words that rearranged rooms. But watching the twins breathe against Aliana's chest, he felt an honest and unperformative sort of power. It was the power to keep the machine that mattered from failing. It was the power to hold the small, stubborn things that resist catalogs and that make up a human life. Aliana felt a new language settling into her, lullabies that were lists of repairs, names that doubled as instructions, and rituals that were tiny acts of care. A specific pressure on the heel when a child had gas, the exact angle to hold a small skull to coax sleep. She found herself teaching a tiny thing the cadence of tools, the way a thumb could steady a spanner, the way a breath could steady a pump. The children, in their first days, already learned the soft hum of relays. They were small and attuned. The ring returned to the workshop bench one evening under the unself-conscious weight of two infants who slept in a shared ragged cradle. Corin placed it there not as a relic, but as a ledger entry, a visible reminder that identity is a tool and its use is deliberate. He spoke to Aliana once, not in the grammar of rulers, but in the syntax of people who fix things. "If the Empire will write history about us," he said, "let them write too about the small things. Let them be obliged sometimes to reckon with washing up and with how many cups of coffee a person needs in a week. If they want to know what we are, let them send their auditors to learn to change a pump shaft properly." Aliana smiled at the absurdity and the defiance. Their jest was not trivialization, but a reorientation. The colony insisted on its own standards for value. They would not be reduced to symbols.
News will sleep in dispatches and wake in new forms. Ambassadorial patience can often be the most menacing kind, meticulous, polite, and relentless. The empire would not accept defeat easily. It would write letters, send auditors, and perhaps, when it judged the political euphony worth the trouble, descend with law. The colony would respond not with a single dramatic stand, but with the accumulation of small resistances, the network of neighbors who could report and disrupt, the misfiled ledgers that would buy time, the human testimonies that would make enforcement costly and complicated. Months passed with the slow density of ordinary life. Small crises came, a heater failure in winter, a boat that needed a hull patch, a shorted conduit that blacked out a quarter of the settlement. Each crisis allowed the colony to show itself as a family. Each crisis was a rehearsal in which the workers practiced the gentle craft of keeping a life together. The twins grew, and their names entered the litany of daily care. They learned to grasp the edge of a spanner and to be soothed by the same hands that soldered relays. They were, in all essential ways, colony children.
And yet the empire is a slow organism. It kept bureaucratic teeth for those who needed to use them. A year after the births, a courier arrived not with a polite invitation, but with a tasking. The capital demanded to examine the custodial arrangements in person. It came as a panel decision, a mandate that would send an imperial inspector, an ordinary functionary with a ledger and an official badge, who would be authorized to verify the record and to make recommendations. The letter's tone was dry, more like a mechanical tick than a shout, but its implications were green light enough for the court to act when they desired. Eliana met the courier's announcement with the same clear gaze she had used when coaxing a relay back to life. The colony gathered. They would be inspected, and they would meet the inspection with competence. If the empire wanted to test their custody, they would find not a prize to be reboxed, but a living network of people who could show, in detail, how two infants were part of a community. They prepared again, manifests carefully reconciled, vaccination logs made robust, the Medtex registry cross-verified with neighbor testimonies recorded on small legal forms. They trained elders to answer expectant questions with the particular tone of truth. They did not lie. They simply turned truth into proof. Corin and Eliana's insistence was not on opacity, but on thick documentation of ordinary life, so that any claimant who tried to move through the forms would have to address the reality of 20 neighbors who would testify to the children's lives. When the inspector came, he was the kind of man who believed in checklists and in the righteousness of forms. He walked with a small, efficient arrogance and with an eye trained to find gaps. He moved through the colony not as a conqueror, but as a bureaucrat who expected lapses. They showed everything: the MedScan readings, the daily chore lists, the ledger entries which, carefully prepared, told a story of custody by presence and care. The inspector's pen moved slowly. He adjusted his tie and made notes in the small leather pad that felt to him like truth. At the end of his tour, he sat with Governor Merrick and with representatives of the workshop and wrote a report that was, in parts, surprising to him. The colony's records were messy but deeply convincing. They were not the tidy, court-friendly papers that would please the capital, but they were a human archive built by practice and by social memory. He left with recommendations not for immediate seizure, but for continued oversight and periodic audits. It was not a victory, but it was a margin. When the inspector's dispatch was sent to the capital, it carried a tone of hesitancy. The empire could attempt to rigidly enforce a claim, but to do so would be to wage a complicated campaign against the fabric of a living community.
The letters from the capital grew more cautious, as if a bureaucracy could feel the friction of public work and chose for prudence. The court, always fond of images, learned it was easier to continue the image of a restoration without forcing its way into the messy business of daily life. Eliana and Corin did not consider themselves triumphant. They considered themselves tired and awake in a new sort of way. The victory was not a clean line. It was a long braid woven through work and the stubborn habit of turning up. They were living proof that ordinariness can be a deliberate politics. One evening, as amber rain slid in lazy threads against the corrugated roof, Eliana sat at the bench with both infants asleep in a shared wrap across her lap. Corin wound a new relay for a pump and hummed a useless tune only he remembered from a palace corridor. The ring sat upon the bench nearest to his elbow, like a coin in a small bowl. He picked it up, and for a moment he let himself feel both memories, the palace and the pump room, as if they were two overlapping resonance fields. He had been an emperor of a certain kind,
He had left that shape to keep his life narrower and truer. He did not apologize for who he had been, nor did he brag about renunciation. He simply set the ring down again and, with a small laugh, smoothed the blanket across the twins. "Will they be told?" Aliana asked. "About the corridor and the ring and the idea that sometimes someone chooses to be small?" "They will know," Corin said. "We will tell them in a way that makes sense, not as a scarlet letter, but as an instruction manual. You may be asked to be displayed. Here are ways to refuse, with shame, with wit, with shelter." They had, in the end, chosen a life that asked nothing of ceremony and everything of fidelity. The empire had not been destroyed. It had been inconvenienced. It had been shown a different grammar, that the value of a life is measured in hands that fix what is broken, in neighbors who share bread, in the daily weight of a child's sleep. Far above, the capital still murmured and took measurements. It would file petitions and draft legislation that might one day come to press the colony more tightly. That was the sort of thing great institutions do. They convert what seems present into questions for the future. For now, the twins slept, small and warm as two new fuses in an old machine, and the colony kept its circuits closed. Aliana picked up a relic, a small relay the size of a pebble that had once been part of a ceremonial bell. She polished it and set it where children could play with it. Corin carved 2 little notches into a scrap of wood and tied them onto a leather thong, a pair of talismans that were more like tools, a small spanner for when a child reached to help, a tiny cloth when a child learned to wipe hands clean. They were ordinaries with the heft of vows.
When the night settled and the amber rain softened into a fine mist, Aliana placed both infants against her chest and felt the faint, separate flutters, like 2 distinct diagnostics. Corin reached for the ring one last time, and then, with a small, resolute movement, he closed his hand and slid the band onto a nail embedded in the bench, a mark not of claim, but of a record. The ring would be there for anyone who wanted to ask the question, who did this belong to? But it would be fixed in a place that spoke the colony's language, a place that repairs and tends, which made identity a part of work and care instead of spectacle. They had not vanquished the court. They had not even guaranteed an easy future. What they had done was to place the most vulnerable lives into a communal net made of neighbors, repairmen, medtechs, and small legal acts. They had converted spectacle into labor until someone who cared to see could read the truth that a family is maintained by hands. When years later the court sent another diplomatic missive, more cautious and tinged with a diplomatic boredom, the colony answered with a ledger full of receipts and the note that twins had begun to learn pump repairs by the age of 5. The answer was not antagonistic. It was a statement of existence. The empire could call them back to the stage, but the stage would now have to include the smell of solder and the sound of children learning to tighten a bolt. That would make the spectacle itself stranger than the court had bargained for. On a warm morning when the rain had ceased and the sky showed a shy line of blue, the twins stuck their small hands into a jar of salvage beads and began to thread them under the careful supervision of a neighbor who had learned patience in nets. One of them grabbed the leather thong that Corin had made and with infant seriousness attempted to put it on. The other poked at a small relay on the workbench and giggled as it chimed. Corin and Aliana watched, and the sight stitched them with something like peace. Aliana lifted her face to the sun, and in a soft voice that was both defiance and benediction said, "We were sent as apology. We answered with a relay." They had been offered restoration and had chosen the gravity of ordinary life. They had refused the rewrite that a distant court would place upon them. They had placed 2 small lives in a nest made by hands and work. If you want the next chapter, to see whether the empire insists or learns to measure people by the work they do rather than the titles they wear, like and subscribe.